Right now, in April 2026, Putin's economic envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, is in Washington meeting with the Trump administration. The topics on the table, according to Reuters, are Ukraine and economic cooperation between Russia and the United States. U.S. sanctions on Russian oil are also reportedly on the agenda. And while that meeting is happening quietly, with no press conference, no joint statement, no cameras, the war in Ukraine is still going. Russian drones are still hitting Ukrainian cities, and Zelensky is watching Washington and Moscow talk about his country's future without him in the room. That is where we are today. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back to a moment that I think defined this entire negotiation. A reporter asked Trump a direct question inside the Oval Office in January 2026. Why hasn't your team been able to end this war? Trump looked at the camera and answered with a single word. Zelensky. Not Putin, not the battlefield, not the complexity of the negotiations, just Zelensky. And the following day, the Kremlin issued its response. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov stood in front of reporters and said, and I want you to hear the exact words, "Yes, we can agree with it. It's indeed so." So let me be precise about what just happened in that exchange. The President of the United States publicly named the leader of a country that Russia invaded as the main obstacle to ending that war. And Russia's government, the country that launched the invasion, publicly agreed with him the next day. That alignment, that moment where Washington and Moscow ended up on the same side of the argument at the same time, is what this video is about. Because what it reveals about where this negotiation actually stands is something most coverage is not explaining clearly. I want to start not with the politics, but with a phone call. A recorded phone call that Bloomberg obtained and published in November 2025. On one end of the line was Steve Witkoff, Trump's chief negotiator, his personal envoy, the man sent to Moscow to broker peace on America's behalf. On the other end was Yuri Ushakov, Vladimir Putin's most senior foreign policy advisor. And what Witkoff says on that recording is something worth paying close attention to. Yuri, here's what I would do. He then proceeds to walk the Kremlin through how to pitch Russia's preferred peace terms directly to Donald Trump. He tells Ushakov that Putin should call Trump, congratulate him on the Gaza ceasefire, say that Russia supported it, tell Trump he respects him as a man of peace, and then, from that position of goodwill, use the moment to sell the Ukraine deal. From that, Witkoff tells Putin's advisor, it's going to be a really good call. The White House did not dispute the recording. Trump called it standard negotiation. But what that call suggests, and I want to be clear, this is my read of it, is that America's negotiator was not simply trying to find a middle ground between two sides. What it suggests is that the process was being shaped in a way that consistently aligned with one side's preferred outcome. And what did that side want? A few weeks after that call, a 28-point peace plan appeared. It was drafted by Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, together with Putin's economic envoy, Kirill Dmitriev. The same Dmitriev who is in Washington right now in April 2026, meeting again with the Trump administration. That 28-point document was then handed to Zelensky and presented to the world as an American peace proposal. Here is what was inside it. Ukraine must cede the entire Donbas region to Russia, including significant territory that Russia does not even currently occupy on the battlefield. Ukraine's military must be dramatically reduced in size. Ukraine is permanently barred from joining NATO, and the occupied territories would be described in the legal text as de facto Russian, a phrase that international law analysts noted goes beyond simply acknowledging military reality and moves toward implying formal recognition. Chatham House, one of Britain's most respected international affairs institutions, reviewed the document and their conclusion was direct. They said it looked less like a peace agreement and more like a demand for capitulation. Multiple U.S. senators who were personally briefed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out of that room and said on the record that the plan read like a Russian wish list. Republican Congressman Don Bacon went further, saying Witkoff fully favors the Russians and called for him to be fired. And by March 2026, Zelensky himself confirmed to Reuters what the U.S. position had become, that Washington is prepared to offer Ukraine security guarantees only once Kyiv agrees to withdraw from the Donbas. In other words, the security guarantee, the one thing Ukraine needs most, is now conditional on giving Russia what it wants first. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters on a topic this serious. I am not claiming Trump made a secret agreement with Putin. What I am saying is something more structural. The architecture of this entire negotiation, who drafted the plan, who coached whom on the phone, who got publicly blamed when talks stalled, and who is sitting in Washington meeting with Trump's team right now, tells a consistent story about which direction the pressure is being applied. And in my view, it is not being applied toward Moscow. Trump told Reuters that Putin is ready to make a deal. He told the New York Times that Zelensky has no cards. He didn't have them from day one. He's only got one thing, and that's Donald Trump. Think about what that framing does to the negotiation. It takes the country that was invaded, the country that has been fighting to defend its own territory for over 3 years, and positions it as the difficult party, the obstacle, the one holding things up. And it takes the country that launched the invasion, the country that has continued striking Ukrainian cities throughout every single round of negotiations, and describes its leader as cooperative, ready, and reasonable. European leaders pushed back hard on this. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said on the record, "It is Russia who rejected the peace plan, not Zelensky." The only Russian response was further missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. But that pushback did not change the American position. And what I think Zelensky genuinely did not see coming, not the friction with Trump, he had experienced that, was the degree to which Washington and Moscow would end up publicly agreeing with each other, on the record, in a way the whole world could read. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, drop a comment below and tell me what you think is really driving this shift. And if you haven't already, hit the like. It genuinely helps this reach people who are trying to understand what is actually happening beneath the headlines. Because we are only at the beginning of this story. What comes next, for Ukraine, for Europe, and for whatever deal eventually gets signed, is where it gets truly complicated. Here's the thing about the peace plan that I don't think is being explained clearly enough. The plan itself is only half the story. The other half is what was happening around it, quietly, in parallel, while the negotiations were supposedly moving forward. And when you put the two halves together, a much more coherent picture emerges, one that is harder to dismiss as coincidence or miscommunication. Let me take you back to October 2025. That is when Witkoff met with Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's economic envoy, in Florida. The two men sat down to sketch the framework for what would eventually become the 28-point peace proposal. What Bloomberg's reporting made clear, through the recordings they obtained, is that this was not a neutral mediation session. In a follow-up call between Ushakov and Dmitriev recorded by Bloomberg, Ushakov opened by saying, "We need the maximum, don't you think? Otherwise, what's the point?" And Dmitriev's response was telling. "I don't think they'll take exactly our version, but at least it'll be as close to it as possible." And when that document was eventually handed to Zelensky, those close to the Ukrainian delegation said it included things Ukraine had publicly ruled out before negotiations even began: full Donbass cession, permanent NATO ban, military size caps. Chatham House called it a demand for capitulation. U.S. senators who were briefed by Rubio called it a Russian wish list, and yet it was presented to the world as the American peace plan. Now, I want to tell you about something that happened in March 2026 that I think is the clearest signal yet of which direction this whole situation is actually moving. Because up until March, you could still argue that the sanctions pressure on Russia was real, that whatever happened in the negotiations, at least the economic tools were being used. In late October 2025, the U.S. Treasury had actually imposed serious new sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two largest oil companies. That was a significant move. It spooked buyers, it pushed Russian oil prices down sharply, and according to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, Russia ended 2025 with an 18% year-on-year drop in oil revenues. That matters, because oil revenues are how Russia funds its military. Every dollar that doesn't flow into the Kremlin is a bullet that doesn't get manufactured. European leaders had spent months lobbying Washington for exactly this kind of economic pressure. And then the Iran war started. When the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran in early March 2026, the Strait of Hormuz became contested, global oil prices surged, and Trump faced a domestic energy problem. His administration's response, announced by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, was to temporarily lift sanctions on Russian oil. A 30-day waiver, they called it, covering Russian crude already loaded on vessels. The stated justification was stabilizing global energy markets. And there may be genuine logic to that in narrow economic terms. But here's what happened immediately after the announcement. Kirill Dmitriev, the same Dmitriev who had been in Florida helping draft the Ukraine peace plan, posted a Russian flag on X with the caption, "Buy Russian oil and gas to maintain a balanced energy supply." And Kremlin spokesman Peskov told reporters that US and Russian interests coincide on this decision. Let me say that again. America lifts sanctions on Russia, and Russia's government says American and Russian interests now coincide. That is not the language of two countries on opposite sides of a negotiation. That is the language of two countries moving in the same direction. Zelensky saw it immediately. He was standing next to Emmanuel Macron in Paris when the sanctions news broke, and he didn't hold back. "Lifting sanctions will lead to a strengthening of Russia's position," he said. "It spends the money from energy sales on weapons, and all of this is then used against us." He calculated that the waiver could give Russia access to around $10 billion in additional revenue from oil it had been unable to sell. $10 billion for a country already running its economy on a war footing, already launching close to 1,000 drones at Ukraine in a single day. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said European leaders were a little bit surprised by the decision, which is diplomatic language for furious. European Council President Antonio Costa was more direct, calling it very concerning and saying it impacts European security. France's Macron said it plainly. In no case should an increase in the price of oil lead us to change our position with regard to Russia. But it had already happened, and Dmitriev was already posting Russian flags on social media. What this sequence of events suggests, and again, I want to be clear, this is my read of the structural logic, not a statement of intent, is that Washington and Moscow have found a series of overlapping interests that keep producing outcomes favorable to Russia. The peace plan favored Russia. The sanctions waiver benefited Russia. And the framing of Zelensky as the obstacle, while Putin is described as ready, gives Russia diplomatic cover to keep fighting while negotiations drag on. What Zelensky said to Reuters is worth sitting with for a moment. He said, Russia is counting on the fact that the United States will not have the strength or patience to bring this to an end. That is a remarkable thing for a wartime president to say about his most important ally. It tells you something about what Kyiv actually believes is happening in Washington. Not what they say publicly in press conferences, but what they believe privately. And if they are right about that calculation, then the question that follows is a serious one. Who actually benefits from a deal that gets done quickly, under pressure, on terms that were largely shaped before Ukraine sat down at the table? Drop a comment below. Do you think the sanctions move was purely about oil prices, or do you think there's something more going on? I genuinely want to know what you think, because this next part of the story is where it gets complicated for everyone. Here is something that almost nobody is framing correctly. While everyone has been focused on the negotiation between Washington and Moscow, a second, entirely different negotiation has been quietly taking shape. One that doesn't include Trump, doesn't require his approval, and is increasingly operating on a separate track. And I think this second negotiation is the one that will actually determine what Ukraine looks like 5 years from now. Let me explain what I mean. In January 2026, 35 countries gathered in Paris for a summit of what has become known as the Coalition of the Willing. Britain and France showed up with a concrete military commitment. They signed a declaration of intent to deploy troops to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, establish military hubs across the country, and provide layered air, land, and sea security guarantees. 27 heads of state attended in person. The joint statement committed the coalition to continued weapons supplies, military training, intelligence sharing, and, critically, a response mechanism if Russia violated any future agreement. And Witkoff and Kushner were there too, which was notable. It was the first time U.S. envoys had joined a Coalition of the Willing meeting. Witkoff said Trump strongly stands behind security protocols for Ukraine. Kushner called it a real milestone. But even as American envoys were standing in Paris saying the right things, the structural tension was already visible. Because the coalition's security model, European troops on the ground, binding commitments, deterrence through presence, is exactly what Russia has said it will never accept. Putin has made clear that NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, under any label, are a red line. And the Coalition of the Willing is, in every meaningful sense, NATO troops under a different name. So here is the bind that Zelensky is sitting in right now. On one side, he has a US-led peace process that is pushing him to give up the Donbass, cap his military, and accept a permanent ban on NATO membership, in exchange for security guarantees whose details remain undefined and whose credibility depends entirely on whether America follows through. On the other side, he has Europe offering real troops, real military infrastructure, real deterrence, but on a timeline and a model that Russia has already rejected and that America has not fully committed to. Zelensky told Reuters plainly in late March 2026, President Trump, unfortunately in my opinion, still chooses a strategy of putting more pressure on the Ukrainian side. He also said something that I think is the most telling line of this entire period. I would very much like the American side to understand that the eastern part of our country is part of our security guarantees. Think about what that means. Zelensky is saying that Donbass is not just territory, it is defense infrastructure. The fortified cities in eastern Donetsk, the defensive lines Ukraine has built over years of fighting, the geographic buffer between Russian forces and the rest of the country. Giving all of that up does not just redraw a map. It removes the physical basis on which Ukraine could defend itself if the ceasefire eventually breaks down. And the history here is not reassuring. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia under the Budapest Memorandum. Those assurances said that if Ukraine's sovereignty was ever threatened, the signatories would bring the matter to the UN Security Council. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. Russia launched a full-scale invasion in 2022. The UN Security Council met. Russia vetoed every resolution. The Budapest Memorandum is now a case study in what happens when a piece of paper replaces a real security structure. Zelensky has said explicitly that he will not sign another piece of paper without something that looks fundamentally different from that. He demanded at the Munich Security Conference in February 2026 a legally binding U.S. security guarantee for a minimum of 20 years. Trump's team is not committed to that. What they have offered is a monitoring mechanism and a vague promise of consequences, details still to be determined. Meanwhile, Russia has not changed its public position at all throughout this entire process. Putin said in December 2025, in front of his military commanders, "If Ukrainian troops leave the territories they occupy, then the hostilities will cease. If they do not leave, we will achieve it militarily." That's not the language of a country making compromises. That is the language of a country that believes it is winning, or at minimum believes it can wait. Carnegie's Russia analyst Tatiana Stanovaya put it clearly. Putin feels more confident than ever about the battlefield situation and is convinced that he can wait until Kyiv finally accepts that it cannot win. And the Institute for the Study of War has noted repeatedly that Russia has continued attacking Ukrainian cities, infrastructure, and energy systems throughout every round of negotiations, not despite the talks, but during them. Close to 1,000 drones in a single day, a pace Russia has sustained throughout the negotiation period, while Dmitriev was in Washington discussing peace. That is the reality on the ground behind the diplomatic language. So what is Europe actually doing about it? More than most people realize. Britain and France committed to military hubs in Ukraine. The EU has pledged to cover Ukraine's financial needs through 2026 and 2027. A reparations loan using frozen Russian assets is under discussion, and the coalition is quietly building the infrastructure, the command structures, the logistics chains, the defensive plans that a post-ceasefire Ukraine would need to actually survive. Germany said it would contribute forces to monitor any ceasefire, though from NATO territory rather than inside Ukraine itself. Belgium offered its Navy and Air Force. The coalition now includes 35 countries. What it does not yet have is clarity on what happens at the moment a deal gets signed, if a deal gets signed, and whether the American commitment to that framework is real and durable, or whether it disappears the moment Trump's attention moves to the next crisis. That is the question that European capitals are quietly asking. And it is the question that Zelensky cannot answer, because the answer depends entirely on what happens in Washington. I want to close with something that I think about every time I look at this situation carefully. Everyone keeps asking whether Trump has sided with Putin. That is the framing. That is the debate. Supporters say no, he is just being pragmatic. He wants the war to end. He is applying pressure on both sides. Critics say yes, the evidence is clear. The plan, the call, the sanctions, the framing of Zelensky as the obstacle. But I think that debate, as it is usually framed, misses what is actually the most important question. And the most important question is not about intent, it is about outcome. Because regardless of what Trump believes privately, regardless of what Witkoff intended when he coached the Kremlin on that phone call, the structural outcome of the last 6 months has consistently moved in one direction. Russia's oil revenues went up. Russia's diplomatic isolation went down. The peace framework was shaped by Russian inputs. The person publicly blamed for the stall was Ukraine's president. And Dmitriev, Russia's man in the room, keeps showing up in Washington, meeting with the Trump administration, pressing for more. That is a pattern. And patterns in geopolitics are more revealing than statements. Now let me tell you what the stakes actually are here, because I think they are larger than the immediate question of what happens to Ukraine's borders. If a peace deal gets signed on terms close to what the current American framework describes, Ukraine gives up the Donbass it still controls, accepts a permanent NATO ban, reduces its military. The signal that sends to every country in the world watching this negotiation is a specific and powerful one. It says that a nuclear-armed country can invade its neighbor, hold out long enough, and eventually get the major power that was supposed to be the neutral broker to help construct a deal on its terms. It says that territorial conquest, if pursued patiently and with enough military staying power, eventually gets recognized and legitimized through the diplomatic process. And it says that the security guarantees America has historically offered, even implicitly, even informally, are not durable in the way that smaller countries have assumed them to be. That matters far beyond Ukraine. It matters for Taiwan, which watches how America handles the gap between its stated commitments and its actual follow-through. It matters for the Baltic states, which are members of NATO, but have spent the last year watching Trump publicly question whether NATO is worth American investment. It matters for every country that has structured its security assumptions around the idea that American credibility is real and consistent. The European response to this has been more serious than most American coverage acknowledges. Britain and France are not just making symbolic gestures. They are committing military infrastructure, command structures, and binding legal frameworks to Ukrainian security, precisely because they have concluded that American credibility on this question cannot be taken as given. When European leaders say they are building a coalition of the willing, what they are actually building in structural terms is a hedge against American unpredictability. They are trying to create a security architecture that does not depend entirely on whether Trump is interested in Ukraine on any given week. That is a remarkable thing for America's closest allies to be doing, openly, in real time. And it tells you something about how the transatlantic relationship has shifted in ways that will last well beyond this particular negotiation. Here's the other thing that I think deserves more attention. Russia is not winning this war cleanly. That is easy to forget when you look at the diplomatic dynamics, because the diplomatic dynamics look favorable to Moscow. But on the battlefield, the picture is more complicated. Military analysts have consistently noted that Russia's advance has been slow and extraordinarily costly. The Institute for the Study of War has estimated Russia is losing around 25,000 troops per month. Analysts say capturing the remaining Donbas territory Ukraine still holds, roughly 6,000 square kilometers, could take years and hundreds of thousands more casualties at current rates. Putin said he would achieve his goals militarily if diplomacy failed. That is a credible threat. But it is also a threat that comes with a price Russia has been paying every single day since February 2022. The question of which side can sustain the cost longer is not settled, and a peace deal that gets signed under pressure on unfavorable terms without credible security guarantees, as Ukraine's own military officials have argued, could simply set the conditions for a third invasion in a few years, after Russia has rebuilt its forces and tested the limits of whatever guarantees were put on paper. That is what Zelensky keeps trying to say, in different ways, in every interview, at every press conference. Not, don't make a deal, but don't make a bad deal that makes the next war more likely. Whether Washington is listening to that argument is, as of April 16, 2026, genuinely unclear. What is clear is this. Dmitriev is back in Washington. The sanctions waiver is on the table again. The Donbas framework remains the American position. And Zelensky is still, in Trump's own public framing, the obstacle. That alignment, between what Moscow wants and what Washington is pushing, is the story. Not because anyone has declared it officially, but because that is what the pattern of decisions, over months, consistently shows. I am not telling you what to think about that. What I am saying is that this is the moment to think about it clearly, without the noise of daily headlines, and to ask yourself what kind of international system we are building, and who actually benefits from the one that is taking shape right now. That is the question worth sitting with, and it does not have an easy answer.